Hey, welcome back, tribe. In today's video, we're going to be going over the best practice standards in social work supervision, so stay tuned. Okay, so before we jump into it, the best practice standards in social work supervision, I actually became a supervisor a couple months ago where I signed up, I met all the requirements, took the courses, all that great stuff, and one of the resources they give us is this right here, the best practice standards in social work supervision for us to read through. And it's not a lengthy read at all. It's actually pretty good. And I think it will be helpful, not just for this ASWB licensure exam, but just for our knowledge in general, especially if we plan to become a supervisor one day. So we're going to read through it together and identify ways to apply these principles to the ASWB exam questions. So if we get a supervision related question on the exam, we know how to navigate it. And in short, think about what is the purpose of supervision, right? Like even if you don't fully know, just think about it. What is the purpose of supervision? And in short, it's to seek out guidance if we unsure about something, right? To gain knowledge, information, and just for that overall social work uh expertise to help guide us. I once heard having a mentor is like having a Chico to life, and I can definitely speak to that. Shout out to my mentor. But in general, we want to seek that guidance, especially when we're unsure about something. In general, we're getting that knowledge, that expertise, that guidance. If we're unsure, right, how to navigate through those ethical dilemmas, and also when we're just going through it ourselves, like we're experiencing that burnout. And I know a lot of us are very familiar with the hours required, those supervision hours to obtain like the LCSW or whatever the equivalent is in your area. But yeah, we're gonna we're gonna dive into it. Okay, so let's just scroll down to page 6, and I'm gonna put the link to this down in the description as well for us. But we're just gonna scroll down to page 6. Okay, so starting off with overview of supervision. There are numerous definitions of supervision. For the purpose of these supervision standards, professional supervision is defined as the relationship between the supervisor and the supervisee, in which the responsibility and accountability for the development of competence, demeanor, and ethical practice take place. The supervisor is responsible for providing direction to the supervisee, who applies social work theory, standardized knowledge, skills, competency, and applicable ethical content in the practice setting. The supervisor and the supervisee both share responsibility for carrying out their role in this collaborative process. Supervision encompasses several interrelated functions and responsibilities. Each of these interrelated functions contributes to a larger responsibility or outcome that ensures clients are protected and that clients receive competent and ethical services from professional social workers. During supervision, services received by the client are evaluated and adjusted as needed to increase the benefit to the client. It is the supervisor's responsibility to ensure that the supervisee provides competent, appropriate, and ethical services to the client. There are many models of supervision described in the literature, ranging from traditional authoritarian models to more collaborative models. Different models of supervision place emphasis in varying degrees on the client, the supervisor, and the supervisee, or the context in which the supervision takes place. Ideally, the supervisor and the supervisee use a collaborative process when a supervision model is selected. However, it is ultimately the responsibility of the supervisor to select the model that works best for the professional development of the supervisee. The supervisory relationship is built on trust, confidentiality, support, and empathetic experiences. Other qualities inherent in the supervisory relationship include constructive feedback, safety, respect, and self care. The standards for social work supervision should be used in conjunction with professional judgment and should not be the exclusive basis on which a decision is made. Supervisors should always familiarize themselves with the supervisory requirements of regulatory and accreditation bodies that control their particular geographic area, work setting, or both. Supervision ensures that supervisees obtain advanced knowledge so that their skills and abilities can be applied to client populations in an ethical and competent manner. Some areas of knowledge and the application of that knowledge to clients can only be translated during the supervisory process. Supervision provides guidance and enhances the quality of work for both the supervisor and the supervisee, and ultimately the client. So, what we just read through is what is the overall purpose, right? We're going to get into some more particulars, but the overall purpose of the supervisor and the supervisee relationship is to promote the growth of the supervisee. The supervisor wants to make sure that the supervisee or supervisees that they're working with is knowledgeable, competent, and able to provide quality services ultimately to the client, right? If you think back to the NASW Code of Ethics 1.01, the first sentence speaks to, as social workers, we have our client's best interest at heart, right? As a supervisor, we want to make quality, competent social workers so that the quality, competent social workers can provide quality, competent, quality services to the clients, the overall population that they serve, right? So when we talk about, what is the role of the supervisor and the supervisee, we want to make sure that generally it's a collaborative process, but we'll get into that a little bit later in this right here, where it's not as collaborative, but generally speaking, it's a collaborative process. And for those that have received supervision before or are currently in the process of receiving supervision, when you're meeting with your supervisor, you're bringing up any issues, any challenges, discussing any of the social work material, right? Any theories possibly, and it's all in all to make the supervisee a more competent social worker, a more competent professional, so that they can provide higher quality services to the clients, the people that we serve. Activities of supervision are captured by three primary domains that may overlap. And the three that they speak to is administrative, educational, and supportive. So, jumping into administrative supervision is synonymous with management. It is the implementation of administrative methods that enable social workers to provide effective services to clients. Administrative supervision is oriented toward agency policy or organizational demands and focuses on a supervisee's level of functioning on the job and work assignment. So, generally speaking, most social workers work in some type of agency setting, right? Some type of organization, and think about the rules, the policies within that organization, within that agency. And when it says right here, again, administrative supervision is synonymous with management, right? Because usually, especially if you're getting supervision hours, supervision services within your agency, that supervisor is usually a manager, right? More times than not. So that's why I say it kind of works synonymously with what's going on within that organizational structure, that agency. When we talk about educational supervision focuses on professional concerns and relates to specific cases. It helps supervisees better understand social work philosophy, become more self aware, and refine their knowledge and skills. Educational supervision focuses on staff development and the training needs of a social worker to a particular caseload. It includes activities in which the supervisee is guided to learn about assessment, treatment and intervention, identification and resolution of ethical issues, and evaluation and termination of services. So when we think about that, right, supervision doesn't look just one way. Our supervisor, when we're seeking supervision, they're providing that guidance, that understanding, that insight, that education on different modalities, how to approach clients that may be struggling in certain areas. Maybe the supervisee exhausted all of where they're at currently with their knowledge, with their skill set, and being able to discuss that with a supervisor is pretty beneficial. So if we get a question on the ASWB exam, whatever form of that ASWB exam it is, LSW, LCSW, the journalist practice one, they're speaking to, hey, as the supervisee, if we're unsure about something, if we need more education about something, we want to go to our supervisor and discuss that with them so that they can better guide us. Because remember, that supervisor, they're a wealth of knowledge, experience. Think about that knowledge that they have. that's very beneficial. They have the experience. So we definitely want to get that within that supervision. It doesn't have to look just one way. We can definitely get that education piece of it as well. And we definitely don't want to leave out the supportive aspect of supervision. So, supportive supervision decreases job stress that interferes with work performance and provides the supervisee with nurturing conditions that complement their success and encourage self efficacy. So, if we get a question on the ASWB exam speaking to burnout or the social worker, the supervisee, kind of going through stuff, it just feeling the increase in workload, the burnout, discuss it with our supervisor. They're there for support. Let's scroll back up a bit before we continue to dive into supportive supervision. Educational and administrative. The paragraph right before says the activities of supervision are captured by three primary domains that may overlap: administrative, educational, and supportive. So, again, it's not just, okay, supervision is strictly for this. Now, someone may seek supervision for a particular purpose. That's one thing. That's fine. But that doesn't mean that while seeking, let's say, education, um, our supervisor can't be supportive, provide that support aspect during that process as well. That doesn't mean, especially when we're in an agency setting, again, for administrative supervision is synonymous with management. Think about the role of a manager, whether you've been in that position or not. When you're working with managers, their role is to make sure that the rest of the team is functioning at an appropriate level, make sure there's no issues, help kind of quarterback what's going on. And if any issues come up, like let's say there's policies impacting a client or clients or something like that, we want to bring that to the supervisor. Now, jumping back into supportive supervision, supervisees are faced with increasing challenges that contribute to job stress. So, again, burnout, including the growing complexity of client problems, unfavorable physical work environments, heavy workloads, and emotional draining environments such as vicarious trauma. Supportive supervision is underscored by a climate of safety and trust where supervisees can develop their sense of professional identity. So, again, if we get a question like this on the exam that's talking about the social worker experiencing, burnout, job stress, heavy workload, their own emotional heaviness, right? Seek supervision. That's what they're there for. Our supervisors are there to help provide that support, help guide us, help provide that information that we need so that we're okay. Because remember, like if the airplane is going down, to say, put on your mask. How can we provide quality service to clients if we're struggling to provide quality services to ourselves and we're just not doing anything about it? No, we don't have to take on that burden. Seek supervision, get that support from our end so that we can enhance the quality of services we're providing to the clients. And also, this last part right here, where they talk about where supervisees can develop their sense of professional identity, you learn a lot about yourself during supervision. Ray, what do you mean? What are you talking about? Think about the things you discuss in supervision. Think about the challenges that come up for yourself that you bring to supervision, especially with the process recordings, right? You're going over them with your supervisor. And when you start to see a trend of some of the challenges that come up when you're working with clients, and you're like, oh, I noticed that I have some challenges when working with this population. Oh, I noticed that my bias may come into play. Oh, I noticed that with this, when clients have these challenges, I'm pretty okay with that. But when they have these challenges, oh, that's an area right there that I really want to work on and become a quality social worker as a whole, even more quality social worker. So you definitely start to learn about yourself. How do you respond when these challenges come up? So this is definitely helpful in being able to process this with again a quality social worker, aka our supervisor. The combination of educational, administrative, and supportive supervision is necessary for the development of competent, ethical, and professional social workers. So now we're going to jump into the qualifications. The qualifications for an approved social work supervisor are specified in the licensing statutes and regulatory standards of each jurisdiction and may include specifications for each level of social work practice or be universal with one set of qualifications for all practice levels. The general qualifications for supervision may include the following: a current license to practice at the specific level or above the level in which the supervision will be provided, and in the jurisdiction in which both the supervisor and the supervisee are practicing, a degree from an accredited school of social work, specified coursework and supervision, a minimum number of continuing education hours and supervisory practice as required by the jurisdiction or both, a minimum of 3 years or more, if required in licensing statutes, of post licensure practice experience, continuing education hours as required for maintenance of supervisory credentials in the practice jurisdiction, and being free from sanction of the licensing board for violations of practical standards. So, again, just kind of going over what's actually required for an LCSW, a social worker, to become a supervisor, and it's making sure that they complete the necessary requirements within that particular area that they're licensed in. I know in New Jersey, you have to hold an LCSW for at least 3 years before you could apply, and then, of course, take the necessary courses and everything. So, this is just kind of a breakdown of that. In addition, social work supervisors should have experience and expertise in the practice arena and with the population of the supervisees practice, such as addictions, children, adolescents, mental health, and community organization. Supervisors should have competencies in the theories and various modalities of treatment and maintain currency through the use of professional journals and continuing education. So, pause for a second, right? Where our supervisors, and as a supervisor, they went through the same thing we did for the most part, right? As far as the schooling and learning about the different theory styles and everything like Freud, Piaget, and all that great stuff, right? And the different modalities where, we're learning about CBT, we're learning about DBT, we're learning about solution focused therapy. So when we talk about making sure that ultimately, whether you're a supervisor or you're a supervisee seeking supervision and you're on the look for a supervisor, making sure that they're competent in those different areas, especially the areas that you'll be practicing in. And scrolling back down where it says through the use of professional journals and continuing education, think of it more so as the supervisor keeping their own notes for themselves, and the continuing education, those CEUs, as we have a certain requirements of a certain number of CEUs that we need to maintain for our license. For there's different levels for like the LSW and the LCSW, but in general, just making sure that we stay up to date what's what's going on in the world and our profession. Effective supervision requires knowledge of the principles of supervision and the ability to demonstrate necessary skills, such as addressing both strengths and challenges of their supervisee, modeling and discussing ethical practice, and providing support and encouragement in the learning context. Supervisors should be familiar with the administrative and organizational structure of the agency or practice domain of the supervisee. So, really think about the overall purpose again of a supervisor. Put yourself in the supervisor's shoe. We might be like, wait a second, Ray, I'm taking my licensure exam, I'm not a supervisor yet. Even if we were, right, just put ourselves in their shoes for a second. We want to help the person in front of us, the supervisee, become a better clinician, a better social worker as a whole. And we do that by, maybe engaging some role playing, identifying their challenges, processing the challenges, some counter transference that may come up when they're working with the population that they're working with. So, again, ultimately, just to become a more quality social worker. And don't forget the strengths aspect, right? Because it's one thing to identify the challenges, and even for ourselves, we may really focus on our challenges like, man, I need to bring up that area. I'm not as good in that area, but we don't want to overlook our strengths. Our strengths is important, right? I know for myself, one of my strengths is being able to identify information and break it down into digestible bites of like, hey, this is the information that you need right here. And as it pertains to, hence why I got this YouTube channel and everything, but as it pertains to working with clients, being able to really tune in and listen to what they're actually saying and being able to reflect it back to them so that they can hear themselves. And I find that's been pretty beneficial. Now, jumping into standard one, context and supervision. General contextual matters important to the supervision process, including the following: So the first one they have here is understanding scope of practice. Supervision may be provided to address a variety of issues. Among the most common is supervision for obtaining an advanced practice license. So literally, as I'm sure we're all aware of, we need a certain amount of supervision hours on top of passing this licensure exam. So they're speaking to that. Particularly a clinical license. Supervision may also be provided to new or recent graduates focusing on the practical aspects of helping clients. It may also include social workers who have been sanctioned following disciplinary actions and those learning a new practice or skill. So, depending on what that disciplinary action is, they may say, okay, you got to meet with the supervisor to kind of address that and work on that. And then, of course, if you're just building your skill set as a whole. Supervisors must be sure they meet the qualifications to become a supervisor and have a clear understanding of the skills and knowledge that the supervisory relationship is designed to help the supervisee develop. So again, just kind of really emphasizing that, making sure that they're qualified to essentially provide that supervision because we don't want an unqualified professional training a professional that's still in development. Communities of practice. Many social workers practice within the community in which they live and may have insider knowledge about community issues that may assist in building a therapeutic alliance, identifying appropriate referrals, or simply understanding clients' concerns. Pause for a second. So on the ASWB exam, um, if it mentions within the question that the supervisor, the social workers work within that community, as we again often do. I know telehealth kind of mixed up some things, but again, we're still technically can be within that community. We're in the know. We live there, right? If we do, um, if we know things, that's why we'll have that insider knowledge. And it's like, oh, I know the resources in the area. I grew up there. I know where this great referral source and all that. So that can be helpful. And being an insider may also result in a dual or multiple relationships. Social work supervisors may address these issues by establishing parameters to the supervisory relationship with attention to boundaries and self monitoring. In all cases, supervisors must ensure that the professional relationship is paramount, meaning at the top above all and protected. So, for those that checked out my NASW Code of Ethics playlist breakdown, where just kind of like what we're doing here, we're going through the Code of Ethics, breaking down what it means and everything like that. Um, in general, dual relationship and all that, we want to avoid that. But small world, small community, right? Where it's not always applicable, right? We go to the barbershop. Oh, we see a client, or again, we live there, right? We just want to make sure that above all, we're being mindful of that. And this isn't to say like, oh, okay, we're going to be buddy buddies and stuff like that. It's like, no, we just want to move accordingly. So we're not causing anything resulting in a dual relationship. And in short, the only type of relationship we want to have with a client is a professional one. We don't want to have a professional one and also have a friendship and romantic one, a business relationship, or anything like that. Interdisciplinary supervision. With the increasing focus on interdisciplinary practice in recent years, social workers may be supervised by a professional of a different discipline. I know this is something that came up. I don't necessarily think this would be on the ASWB exam, like this information, but it is pretty interesting because I would hear about this where, hey, can a social worker be supervised by an LPC, like a counselor, and like vice versa and stuff like that? So again, uh, although this may be appropriate within the team or unit context, so like let's say I know the outpatient facility I worked at, we had a mix of social workers, counselors, and everything. Although this may be appropriate within the team or unit context, social workers should seek supervision or consultation from another social worker with regard to specific social work practices and issues. Similarly, a social worker providing supervision to a member of another discipline, so like an LCSW, who's a supervisor providing services like the supervision and everything to a counselor, um, should refer that supervisee to a member of her or his own profession for practice specific supervision or consultation. Because in general, although they're similar, they're still different, right? We have different boards and everything. So in general, like if it's within that agency, that organization, where it's like, oh, okay, like it makes sense, it's not, but in general, we just want to kind of pair people with the appropriate license, because that's our board. It just makes the most sense. Cultural awareness and cross-cultural supervision. Social work supervisors should adhere to the NASW standards of or for cultural competence and social work practice, and have specialized knowledge and understanding about the culture of the client population served by the supervisee. Supervisors should be able to communicate information about diverse client groups to supervisees and help them to use appropriate methodological approaches, skills, and techniques that reflect their understanding of the role of culture in the helping process. So, in short, granted, we're not going to know everything about every culture, but we just want to know something about them, right? We don't want to, especially if we're in the supervisor position and the supervisee, they're coming from they have a different background than us, and they're working with a different background, a culture that the supervisor may not be familiar with. We want to have, as a supervisor, we want to have some information. And if you're the one seeking a supervision, looking for a supervisor, you want to make sure that they have the necessary knowledge, where it's like they're familiar, they have some knowledge with working with, these different populations, have some information, because again, how can they necessarily help us? And as a supervisor, how can we help our supervisee if we have no knowledge of another culture or background, anything like that? So again, we just want to educate ourselves as much as possible, so that we can provide that quality service. And going to what we were just talking about, the supervisor who is supervising a social worker with a different cultural background should develop knowledge about that culture as it relates to social work practice. Primary sources of information may include the supervisee or other practitioners familiar with the supervisee's cultural community. So, again, like the resources around us, speaking both as a supervisor and even as a supervisee, right? That's how we grow. And in particular, if you're at an agency setting, what's wrong with talking with our colleagues? Gaining more information about a background, a culture, a religious faith that we're not as familiar with. Those are our coworkers. We want to use our team to grow as a whole, and we can share our information, our knowledge as well. So now, dual supervision and conflict resolution. It is best practice to have a contractual agreement or memorandum of understanding, delineating the role of each supervisor, including parameters of the relationships, information sharing, priorities, and how conflicts will be resolved. If no agreement exists, the immediate employment supervisor may have the final say. And this makes a lot of sense, because we just we just want to avoid any confusion, right? We want to get it all in writing. And memorandum, that kind of talks about like that agreement. Just think of it like a contract where everything's all laid out. We're all on the same page, all parties involved. And the reason why this is because, let's say, where someone, a supervisee, is working at, uh, it's hard for another, like an outside supervisor, to really direct them, and they're limited based off of that organization that they work with. And if that supervisee is seeking supervision, or getting obtaining supervision from someone in that organization, again, you want everyone on the same page, right? That's also why when you look at the principles of even working with couples, we don't want any triangulation going on. We want to all discuss the information in the same room, so that there's no misinformation and things happening without the other party knowing. It's kind of like the same principle here. It's just more so being applied to this setting versus working with a couple. And it makes sense that the employer gets the final say, because at the end of the day, that's where the person, the social worker, is working, and they're seeing the ins and outs of the company and the policies and everything like that. So ultimately, they'll get the final say. And if we do find ourselves in that situation where we're the supervisee, and it's like, okay, I'm going to be getting outside supervision for whatever the reason may be, and I'm also getting some form of supervision at this agency, at this organization, we definitely want to discuss it with all parties and make sure that an agreement is made and established, which outlines the everything. Standard 2, conduct of supervision. So, the underlying agreement between supervisors and supervisees includes the premise that supervisees depend on the skills and expertise of supervisors to guide them. Respect for the different roles that supervisors and supervisees play in the supervisory relationship is a key factor in successful supervision. To maintain objectivity in supervision, it is important to, and remember, when they talk about objectivity, they're not talking about things being subjective, where it's like our opinion and everything like that. This is just being objective about the different roles and how we're going about it. It's important to negotiate a supervision contract with mutually agreeable goals, responsibilities, and timeframes. Provide regular feedback to supervisees on their progress towards these goals. Establish a method for resolving communication and other problems in the supervision sessions so that they can be addressed, and identifying feelings supervisees have about their clients that can interfere with or limit the process of professional services. So they're talking about that counter transference. In short, remember, transference is when the client feels some type of way towards the social worker. Counter transference is when the social worker, the professional, feel some type of way towards the client, whether it's a romantic attraction, whether it's hey, someone, this client looks like someone in a social worker's life that they don't have like the best relationship with. And overall, the countertransference comes into play when uh, it's impacting the quality of service that the social worker is providing to the client because of that, what's going on internally with the social worker. Seek supervision. Confidentiality. Supervisors must ensure that all client information be kept private and confidential, except when disclosure is mandated by law. Supervisees should inform clients during the initial interview that their personal information is being shared in a supervisory relationship. Supervisors also have an obligation to protect and keep the supervisory process confidential and only release information as required by the regulatory board to obtain licensure or, if necessary, for disciplinary purposes. So, in general, think about, especially if you're getting supervision within an agency, within an organization, it's usually built within there that if I know at the outpatient facility I was at, if any clients coming in seeking treatment, the papers that they sign, all the employees there is essentially going to have access to their records, like the different like counselors. And because when, let's say, a social worker calls out sick, or if just people need to be moved around, like the staff members, there's going to be different people that meet with them for psychoeducational groups, maybe even facilitating a process group and completing evaluations and stuff like that. So it would be, again, within an agency organization setting, it would be it'd be wild to have like, what would that be, like 50 releases for every single, okay, now you can work with this counselor, you can work with all these different social workers. That's just, they're usually built in that regard. But this is more so speaking to that, hey, the reason why we're going to be potentially discussing information is to for the betterment and improving quality services and everything like that. And remember that supervisor, they're a social worker too, so they're under confidentiality. They're not exactly sharing client information, and you don't have, as a supervisee, you don't have to give very specific details. For example, if I'm meeting with a supervisor and I'm having a hard time helping a client who has anxiety related issues, right? And I've tried all the different approaches, and I'm meeting with my supervisor because I know they have a lot of experience working with clients with anxiety. I'm not exactly saying, hey, so I'm working with this client, John Doe. They live here. They're this tall, and they did it. Hey, supervisor person, I tried these techniques with a client that's been experiencing a significant amount of anxiety, and we haven't made any progress. I know you have a lot of experience working with clients with anxiety. You have any ideas on how I should approach it? And then, because it's a supervisor with that additional experience, that knowledge, that expertise, they could say, oh, I understand. I have experience working with clients like that. Try using this approach. And notice how I didn't go and say, oh, their name is John Doe and they're this tall and da 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 da. All that information is not needed, right? Notice how I can generalize it out and still get what I need from the supervision. Contracting for supervision. So, in situations in which an agency may not have a clinical supervisor, who meets the qualifications of a supervisor as required by the regulatory board. A social work supervisee may contract for supervision services outside of the agency to qualify for a clinical license. Supervisees should contact the regulatory board in their jurisdiction in advance of contracting to confirm whether such a practice is permitted and confirm the documentation required from the supervisor. The time frame required for the supervision period should also be confirmed. So, if we're working at an agency, organization, facility where they can provide supervision in-house, great. And honestly, it's preferred because again, it's just easier that way. Where they already know like the job task of the supervisee and everything like that, right? And you can already arrange the meetup times because you guys work in the same organization, agency, right? But unfortunately, there's not, you may be the only social worker at that agency, at that facility. And if we're working towards our clinical hours, for example, we need to get we need to get those hours in. So we just want to make sure that we're dotting all our I's, crossing all our T's. And remember what we read earlier, even after we find that outside supervisor, that LCSW, right, with the necessary requirements and all that, we want to still establish a contractual agreement between all parties to make sure all parties is on the same page. And again, we're dotting our I's and we're crossing our T's. Contracting for outside supervision can be problematic and may place a supervisor at risk. Uh, if the supervisee is paying for the services, he or she can dismiss the supervisor, especially if disagreements or conflicts arise. So we are allowed to terminate the services being provided, especially if we're paying for it. The supervisee can also blame the supervisor if there is failure in the licensing process. In addition, the supervisor may encounter case management conflicts between the supervisee and the agency. So notice how it's going right back to making sure that if it is one of these situations, making sure that everything is understood. Notice how above it earlier it talked about making sure that if any issues come up, it's within that contract how to go about it, how it's going to be resolved, contacting the supervisor in an appropriate amount of time because we don't want our supervisor ghosting us or nothing like that. And we don't want to ghost our supervisor. Again, this is like outside when we're seeking outside supervision and everything because no matter what side we're on as the supervisor or the supervisee, we just want to make sure that everything's outlined so we know exactly how to approach these situations that they come up. You see, they double down on it again. Development of a contractual agreement among the social worker, the supervisor, and the employing agency is essential in preventing problems in the supervisory relationship. The agreement should clearly delineate the agency's authority and grant permission. Again, the agreement should clearly delineate the agency's authority and grant permission for the supervisor to provide clinical supervision. Evaluation responsibilities, periodic written reports, and issues of confidentiality should also be included in the agreements. Supervisors and supervisees should also sign a written contract that outlines the parameters of the supervisory relationship. Frequent written progress reports prepared by the supervisor should be required and, if appropriate, meet the ongoing standards established by the jurisdictions and agency requirements. So again, we just want to make sure that there's no surprises. Everyone's on the same page. It's easier to avoid issues versus responding to them, right? It's easier to just say, you know what, we're not saying it will, right? We just want to broken record, dot our I's, right? And cross our T's. Leadership and role model. Supervisors play a key role in the professional development of their supervisees. The actions and advice of the supervisor are keenly observed by supervisees and consequently influence much of the supervisee's thinking and behavior. Teaching is an important function of the supervisor who models the behavior the supervisee will emulate. Supervisors should create a learning environment in which supervisees learn about the internal and external environments in which they work, as well as the environments in which their clients find themselves each day. So, all this is speaking to is, I even think back to human development, right? Think about how people grow up, their environments, what influences them, right? Our parents, our caregivers are our first teachers, and that's going to influence and help mold and shape us into, ultimately who we become. Now, of course, we can definitely identify things, change things, make improvement, continue to grow, but that influence. Now, think about it in terms of a supervisee, right? Someone in school, someone just new to the field, right? Doesn't have too much experience. That internship, right? I know for myself. Shout out to Pete, my supervisor. I had a great experience with him at the outpatient facility. Really helped shape me into a really quality clinician. That's important because that like sets the stage. Now, of course, we continue to grow and everything like that, but as a supervisor, we want to make sure that we're setting that foundation for success. And as a supervisee, especially if we're seeking a supervisor, we want to make sure that everything that was spoken above, that the supervisor meets all those requirements. And I don't just mean like, are they able to provide supervision? I mean, are they what we're looking for as far as a quality supervisor for whatever population we plan to work with and everything like that? So definitely important. And it goes right back into it, competency. Social work supervisors should be competent and participate in ongoing continuing education, so those CEUs, and certification programs and supervision. Supervisors should be aware of growth and development in social work practice and be able to implement evidence-based practice into the supervisory process. Supervisors should also be aware of their limitations and operate within the scope of their competence. When specialty practice areas are unfamiliar, supervisors should obtain assistance or refer supervisees to an appropriate source for consultation in the desired area. So, again, this is all speaking to like the principles of everything. Only providing services in areas that we're able to, that we're competent in, right? And if we aren't competent in those areas, making the necessary referrals and kind of giving that supervisee the direction that they need, redirect them to that professional so that they can gain that knowledge, that understanding, that insight, that the expertise so that they can, get what they need from that desired area. Supervisory signing off. So supervisors should submit reimbursement claims only for services that they performed. So being ethical. Signing off on services performed by a supervisee who is ineligible to seek reimbursement is fraudulent. I mean, supervisors and supervisees should be aware of the statutes and regulations addressing this matter in their jurisdiction. So just making sure that, we're being ethical. Self-care. So if we get some of those ASWB exam related questions that speaks to self-care, it is crucial for supervisors to pay attention to signs of job stress and address them with their supervisees and themselves. So notice how this is speaking to the role of a supervisor. And on the other end, as the supervisee, we want to bring that to our supervisor's attention. So again, for self-care, it is crucial for supervisors to pay attention to signs of job stress and address them with their supervisees and themselves. Supervisors should provide resources to help supervisees demonstrating symptoms of job stress and make outside referrals as necessary. So depending on how significant it is, therapy or just other resources may be needed. Peer consultation can be helpful to supervisors and supervisees in such cases. Standard 3, legal and regulatory issues. Social work supervisors share responsibilities for the services provided to clients. Liability of supervisors has been determined by the courts and includes direct liability related to negligent or inadequate supervision and vicarious liability related to negligent conduct by supervisees. So both parties share responsibility. Supervisors and supervisees should both have professional liability insurance. In an agency setting, a supervisor's potential liability is affected by his or her level of responsibility and authority. Because again, it's a bit different because they're working within a certain system. Supervisors should familiarize themselves with the scope of their responsibility and authority, which may be specified in an agency written policy manual, the supervisor's job description, or a written contractual agreement. The requirements and expectations of a supervisor's position also may affect liability. especially in situations in which the supervisor may have competing demands and is unable to adequately perform his or her supervisory functions, such as situations may present legal challenges. So just again being aware of that and being able making sure that all parties like fully understand what they're getting themselves into and their roles to ultimately provide these services. Liability. Direct liability may be charged against a supervisor when inappropriate recommendations carried out by a supervisee are to a client's detriment. Direct liability can also be charged when a supervisor assigns duties to a supervisee who is inadequately prepared to perform them. Social work supervisors should be proactive in preventing boundary violations that should be discussed at the beginning of the supervisory relationship. A supervisor should not supervise family members, current or former partners, close friends, or any person with whom the supervisor has had a therapeutic or familial relationship. In addition, a supervisor should not engage in a therapeutic relationship with the supervisee. So, again, we just want to have one type of relationship, which is a professional one, and not cause any like conflict of interest, dual relationships, or anything like that. Vicarious liability involves incorrect acts or omissions committed by the supervisee that can also be attributed to the supervisor. Supervisees can be held to the same standard of care and skill as that of their supervisors and are expected to abide by the statutes and regulations of their jurisdiction. So, again, both parties sharing responsibility is not just all on the supervisor or all on the supervisee. For purposes of risk management, supervisors should ensure that services provided to clients by supervisees meet or exceed standards or practice, maintain documentation of supervision, monitor supervisees' professional work activities, identify actions that might pose a danger to the health and or welfare of the supervisees, clients, and take prompt and appropriate remedial measures, identify and address any condition that may impair a supervisee's ability to practice social work with reasonable skill, judgment, and safety. So, again, notice how all this is about being proactive, right? Being proactive both as the supervisor and as a supervisee and discussing anything. And that's why, you know, how we talk about with clients the importance of establishing that therapeutic relationship because it creates that warm, safe environment, that openness. The same thing wants to be created honestly in any relationship, like your friendship and and all that, and romantic partner, all of that, right? But as it pertains to this, it definitely wants to be established. If you're going to be working with a supervisee or depending on what side you're on, a supervisor, supervisee, we definitely want to have this established. Regulations. The statutes and regulations for the qualifications of supervisors and licensing requirements for supervisees may vary by jurisdiction. An increasing number of jurisdictions are requesting supervision contracts and plans prior to the commencement of supervision. It is the responsibility of supervisors and supervisees to familiarize themselves with the specific requirements in their jurisdictions for the qualifications for supervision, licensure, supervision contracts and plans, and other requirements. Many social work regulations require all supervision for purposes of licensure to be provided by a licensed clinical social worker. So this is really speaking to being informed, whether you're on the supervisor side of it or you're on the supervisee side of it. Be informed. Don't just assume that the supervisor knows everything that you need, and don't just assume that the supervisee knows everything that they need, right? We want to do our own research, come together, and really like break that down so that there's no surprises throughout this process. Documentation. Documentation is an important legal tool that verifies the provision of services. Supervisors should assist supervisees in learning how to properly document client services performed, regularly review their documentation, and hold them to high standards. Each supervisory session should be documented separately by the supervisor and the supervisee. Documentation for supervised sessions should be provided to the supervisee within a reasonable time after each session. Social work regulatory boards may request some form of supervision documentation when supervisees apply for licensure. Records should be safeguarded and kept confidential. So again, supervisor educating the supervisee on literally how to perform the job roles, what makes good documentation, ways to improve it, making sure that it meets all the appropriate standards and everything like that, where we don't want to say, okay, just do what you do, and then and if we're on the supervisees end of it, we want to make sure that, again, us taking accountability as well, speaking with our supervisor, like, hey, how does this work, how do you document, like, am I doing everything, I'm putting in the appropriate like billing code and everything like that. So collaborative process. We just all want to make sure that we're on the same page with this. When appropriate, supervisors should train supervisees to document for reimbursement and claim submission. So again, when appropriate. Other legal concerns, the experienced social worker developing skills in a new specialty area may receive supervision limited to the new area of practice. A supervisor is selected on the basis of his or her expertise in the specialty area. Having a supervision contract or plan detailing the obligations of both parties may be helpful. So again, I wouldn't even treat it as optional. Like, even if it falls into one of those categories where it's like, oh, it's optional in this particular situation, still plan it out. Make sure that everyone, again, is on the same page. We're dotting our I's, we're crossing our T's, we're doing all that stuff to make sure that there's no surprises or hiccups or anything like that. Supervision may be required following disciplinary action. In such situations, an agreement between the supervisor, supervisee, and other authority should be developed to address such items as corrective issues to be covered in supervision, information sharing between the parties, and frequency of supervision. So again, making sure to dot our I's, cross our T's, everyone's on the same page. Social work supervisors may retain a consult for case consultation and review as necessary, especially when conflicts arise. So again, we just want to avoid any surprises, anything like that. Make sure everyone's on the same page and all those things are established before and not afterwards. Standard 4, ethical issues. Social work supervisors and supervisees may face ethical dilemmas when providing services to clients. To address those dilemmas, the supervisor and the supervisee should have a thorough knowledge of the code of ethics under which they practice. The NASW Code of Ethics serves as a guide to assist supervisors in working with ethical issues that arise in supervisory relationships. The following precepts from the NASW Code of Ethics are incorporated throughout these standards. And then this is when we get into the section 3. 3.01a, social workers who provide supervision or consultation should have the necessary knowledge and skill to supervise or consult appropriately and should do so only within the area of knowledge and competence. 3.01b, social workers who provide supervision or consultation are responsible for setting clear, appropriate, and culturally sensitive boundaries. And 3.01c, social workers should not engage in any dual or multiple relationships with supervisees in which there's a risk of exploitation or potential harm to the supervisee. So again, only the professional relationship. 3.01d, social workers who provide supervision should evaluate supervisee performance in a manner that is fair and respectful. And supervisors have the responsibility to address any confusion that supervisees may encounter as a result of ethical dilemmas or ethical demands. A supervisor should be aware of the differences between professional ethics, core values, and personal moral beliefs, and help the supervisee to distinguish these elements when making practice decisions. Supervisors can also use the supervisory relationship as a training ground for ethical discretion, analysis, and decision making. And as a thought, this wasn't necessarily stated within here, but as for any supervisors looking at this video and any supervisees looking at this video, whoever brings it up, if both of you bring it up, that's great. But again, whether you're on the supervisor side or the supervisee side, I know when I take on my first supervisee, I plan to do this. Literally, discuss the code of ethics. Session number 1, right? Part of the assignment I'm gonna give to my supervisee is to read the code of ethics or listen to my playlist on it, and then we're going to discuss it within the first 1-2 sessions right off the bat for any supervisee that I have. And I think that's a really good practice because we get to learn about it as the supervisee, right? And it stays at the forefront of both parties' mind. Even if like you're a supervisor, you haven't read it in a while, right? It just keeps it at the forefront of our mind. Ethical decision making. Supervisors help supervisees learn ethical decision making, a process that is both cognitive and emotional. Supervisors should discuss and model the process of identifying and exploring problems, looking at issues, values, principles, and regulations. Supervisors and their supervisees should discuss possible consequences as well as costs and benefits of certain actions. So, kind of weighing out like the pros and cons. Um, they should explore what actions best achieve fairness, justice, and respect for others, make a decision about actions to be taken, and evaluate them after implementation. When a supervisee makes an ethical mistake, he or she, with the assistance of the supervisor, should try to ameliorate any damage and learn how to avoid that mistake in the future. So ameliorate, speaking to like appropriate ways to address it. So again, to avoid that mistake in the future. If appropriate or required by the jurisdiction, the violation may have to be reported to the licensing board, again, depending on exactly what it is. Now looking at boundaries. The supervisory relationship is an excellent forum for supervisees to learn about boundaries with clients. Ethical issues related directly to supervision include the nature of the professional responsibility to the supervisee, appropriate boundaries and responsibilities when dealing with incompetent or unethical behavior. Becoming involved in a romantic or familial relationship with a supervisee is an ethical violation and should be strictly avoided because it creates marked role conflict that can fatally undermine the supervisory relationship. So, in short, just no, just don't do it. Um, if the supervisor recognizes a potential boundary issue with the supervisee, he or she should acknowledge it, assess how the boundary issue has affected supervision, and resolve the conflict. So, again, we just want to avoid all this. But if we identify something, nip it in the bud right away and then, proceed. Although the supervisory relationship is between professionals, supervisors usually have more power in the relationship than supervisees. To avoid boundary problems and conflicts of interest with the supervisee, the ethical supervisor must accept his or her power and be comfortable in using that authority to ensure accountability and protect clients. Because at the end of the day, it is a difference in power dynamics, right? Because we have a supervisee and we have a supervisor, and again, we just want to make sure that, everyone's adhering to their roles. Other ethical considerations include the following. A supervisor should always focus on the goals of supervision and the nature of the supervisory relationship and avoid providing psychotherapy services to the supervisee. Supervisors working with more than one supervisee should see each supervisee as an individual and adapt to the supervisee's needs. At the same time, supervisors must be fair and consistent when providing supervision to multiple supervisees. Self disclosure. Supervisors should be discreet in sharing personal information and not allow it to become the focus of supervision. When personal information is disclosed, it should be brief and support the goals of supervision. Kind of going back to, what's the reason for sharing? Is it to, help kind of help support the supervisee? For example, if the supervisee were to say something like, "Oh, I made an error, a mistake," right? And especially if it was something innocent, because they're, supervisees learning, growing, right? And if the supervisor were to say like, "Listen, you're human and you're still learning and growing. I remember when I was an intern, I made X, Y, Z mistakes. Or I remember, my first year, my first, year number two as a, working at an agency, I made this mistake. And then we just kind of bring it back to the focus of the supervisee. Completely appropriate. This is not the supervisor like, taking over. Like if you imagine when someone's you're having a conversation with someone, you're talking to them about something, and then they just start to take over the conversation and talk about their situation and everything. They're saying we just want to be mindful when doing this. So again, when personal information is disclosed, it should be brief and support the goals of supervision. Supervisors should explain their comments and rationale to help supervisees gain understanding of appropriate techniques to use in the interview process with clients. And attending to safety. Supervisors make supervisees aware of safety issues and train them how to respond to workplace conflict, respond to threats and harassment, protect property, and deal with assaults and their emotional aftermath. Supervisors help supervisees plan for safety in the office and in the community by learning nonviolent response strategies and appropriate ways to respond to crisis. So, you know, depending on the setting that you're in, uh, we want the supervisees to be in the know of like, hey, how do I navigate this situation if an incident happens? Where are like the emergency exits and all of that, the numbers I should contact if I'm faced with the issue or regarding like a hostile client, a family member, a hostile client, how should I proceed? And in short, um, de-escalation techniques, we don't want to say like match their energy and aggression, because again, that's what is that really doing, right? That's putting the social worker at risk. Alternative practice, the social work supervisor should decide whether an alternative practice, a non-traditional social work intervention, is the best modality of treatment for a supervisee to use with the client, because again, depending on that particular situation, it may be. When a supervisee uses an alternative practice, the supervisor should have expertise of that practice and ensure that the supervisee has the prerequisite training and knowledge to perform that alternative practice. In situations in which the supervisor does not have the skills to provide the alternative practice, it may be necessary to involve a second supervisor. In such cases, the two supervisors should work closely together to avoid conflicts and ensure effective use of the alternative practice for the client. So again, notice how, in short, to this point so far, make sure that as far as the supervisor goes, make sure that supervisor is qualified, knowledgeable, and they want to promote the growth of the supervisee as a whole. Make sure that all the, dot all our I's, cross all our T's, we're doing everything by the board. And if any conflicts, whatever the conflicts may be, come up, we address them, we nip them in the bud. And again, things still happen because you can't see everything that's going to happen, right? Make sure that they're still addressed appropriately and on the supervisor's end if they don't know something, because it's not like, although they're a professional with experience and everything, doesn't mean they know everything, right? So they're saying even on their end, seeking out that appropriate knowledge from a professional social worker that does, and then bringing them into the mix so that we can get the needs met of that supervisee and ultimately the client. Standard 5, technology. The rapid growth and advances in technology present many opportunities and challenges in the supervisory relationship. When using or providing supervision by technological means, supervisors and supervisees should follow standards applied to a face-to-face supervisory relationship. Supervisors should demonstrate competency in the use of technology for supervision purposes and keep abreast of emerging technologies. Supervisors should be aware of the risk and benefits using technology in social work practice and implement, them in the learning process for supervisees. So some of the common risk and benefits is, think of everything that comes when using technology, like the laptop turned off, the weather, internet issues, like all of it. All applicable federal, provincial, and state laws should be adhered to, including privacy and security rules that may address patient rights, confidentiality, allowable disclosure, and documentation, and include requirements regarding data protection, encryption, firewalls, and password protection. So just make one of the things is, especially if you're providing, let's say, therapy services via telehealth, is just confirming the location of the client. So for example, I'm only licensed in New Jersey. So even if the client is in New York, and for those that don't know, New York is about like an hour and some change away, hour and 20 minutes, 30 minutes away, right? Depending on what part you're going to. And because I'm only licensed in New Jersey, even though it's so close and we're providing services online, I wouldn't be able to provide services. I would just let them know, like, hey, we need to reschedule. I would do like a brief check-in with them, make sure they're okay, and just reschedule and let them know that I'm only licensed in New Jersey. So both myself and the client have to be in the state I'm licensed in to provide services to them. So if I was dual licensed, so I was licensed in New Jersey and New York, then I'll be perfectly fine. But we can only provide services in the states that we're licensed in when you and the client is in that location. When supervision is being provided for licensure purposes, supervisors and supervisees have the responsibility to familiarize themselves with specific definitions and requirements by social work regulatory boards for the use of technology in practice. For successful communication, compatible equipment, software, and other infrastructure are required by both parties. So just make sure we're all in the loop. Distant supervision. The use of technology for supervision purposes is gradually increasing. Video conferencing is a growing technological tool used to provide supervision, especially in remote areas. Some jurisdictions allow electronic means for supervision. Others may limit the amount of supervision that can be provided from a distance. When using technology to provide distance supervision, one must be aware of standards of best practice for providing this tool and be knowledgeable of the statutes and regulations governing the provision of such services. So again, just making sure you check with your area, state regulations, statutes, all that stuff to make sure that we're actually able to and we're adhering to all the guidelines and everything. Risk management. Using technology in social work practice presents many risks. Supervisors should ensure a learning process that emphasizes a standard of care consistent with the NASW Code of Ethics, NASW, and the ASWB Standards of Technology and Social Work Practice, Canadian Social Workers Code of Ethics, licensure laws, applicable organization policies and procedures, and regulations for businesses. Doing so ensures high quality services, protects the supervisor, supervisee, and client, and safeguard against malpractice issues. So again, just doing our due diligence if we plan to do that. Evaluation and outcomes. The evaluation and outcome of the supervisory process is an integral part to the development of professional social workers. The evaluation of the supervisee, as well as the evaluation of the impact and outcome of supervision, is a significant responsibility of the supervisor. An evaluation serves many purposes, which vary depending on the setting and context. An evaluation can be used to determine whether a supervisee is able to practice social work with increasing independence in a competent and ethical manner. An evaluation can also be used for licensure or credentialing reasons in your job performance, probation, promotion, or merit salary increases. Social work supervisors have the responsibility of evaluating the performance of supervisees in a fair manner with clearly stated criteria. So even when we think about program evaluation, read it backwards. Program evaluation, evaluating a program, just see where it's at, how it's doing, and it's applicable to all these things right here when we're doing an evaluation. All evaluations have several common elements. The first element is a formal agreement between the supervisor and the supervisee regarding expectations for the outcome of the evaluative process. At the beginning of each supervisory relationship, the supervisor, in collaboration with the supervisee, should prepare written measurable goals and specific guidelines to evaluate the supervisee's performance. In addition, the evaluation should include a time frame for goal attainment and a systematic approach for disengaging from supervision once the goal has been reached. Tools used to measure supervision goals can be a combination of various predetermined criteria, including case studies, progress notes, conversations, the successful implementation of treatment plans, and client outcomes. To enhance learning and increase the effectiveness of supervision, a systematic procedure for ongoing supervisory feedback is necessary. Feedback during the supervisory process is planned and continuous and in written and verbal form. Planned supervisory feedback allows both the supervisor and the supervisee to make modifications if needed to improve professional practice and skill development. Continuous feedback also helps to determine the impact and effectiveness of the received supervision. When using an evaluation as a learning process, clinical and administrative errors can be expected and do occur, but should not be used in a punitive manner. So showing, grace to the situation, and also if we're getting ongoing feedback, like if we have a designated time for feedback for the supervisor to give the supervisee and the supervisee to give the supervisor, that's helping the growth on both ends. And again, if any issue comes up, because if that warm, safe environment was created, the healthy environment, both parties feeling comfortable sharing, that just promotes growth. And if anything comes up, we can address it. The final stage of an evaluative process should include a discussion of future challenges that the supervisee may encounter and the resources that the supervisee can use to resolve those challenges. So kind of just preparing them for what can come next. The goals of an evaluation process are to improve the delivery of services to clients, maintain ethical and competent social work practice, and protect the public. Structuring an evaluation process focused on the supervisory learning experience and the identification of future learning needs is an important part of the supervisory process. Supervisors have the responsibility of researching and selecting the best evaluative tool for supervision. For purposes of licensing and credentialing, a supervisory evaluation is an aid to public protection. The supervisor is the last gate to competent, independent clinical practice and one of the best resources regarding the supervisee's fitness to practice social work. The supervisor has the responsibility of identifying incompetent or unethical practice and taking appropriate steps to properly address the errors of their supervisee and terminating the supervisory relationship. Ending the supervisory relationship is just as important as beginning it, and a supervisor should devote attention to it. Termination occurs when the supervisor or supervisee leaves the organization or is promoted or when the supervisee obtains licensure. It may also occur when the goals are achieved in the agreement between the supervisor and the supervisee. It is important for supervisors to identify early on the dynamics of termination as they emerge and assist supervisees in learning specific skills to deal with termination. Helping supervisees to address their concerns about termination can help make termination a good experience. Kind of like it sounds like when we're even terminating a client, right? Where we don't want to just do it all abrupt and everything. We want to prepare them for it so that we can address any issues that come up. And they're expecting it, and it's a good thing because they're reaching their goals. They're coming towards the end of the services being provided. So again, helping supervisees to address their concerns about termination can help make termination a good experience. All documentation by the supervisor should be completed by the time of termination. It is unprofessional and possibly unethical to withhold status or final reports, particularly where such reports are required for licensing documentation. Two germane areas of work. So germane meaning things that kind of relate with each other, relate with one another. Two germane areas of work require attention. So number one is the termination of the supervisory relationship, and two, termination of the supervisee-client relationship. When the supervisor is leaving, if appropriate, a smooth transition to a new supervisor should be arranged. The skills used in ending a supervisory relationship can also be used with clients. A supervisor models for the supervisee the skills required to terminate with clients and address concerns that he or she may have about termination. Supervisory focus on the termination phase helps to ensure a quality and safe termination of the supervisee client relationship and makes for a positive supervisory supervisee transition. And as we scroll down, here's all the references and everything like that that they mentioned here below. Okay, tribe, that's it for today's video. That was the best practice standards in social work supervision. So just as a quick recap, what's the purpose of supervision? The purpose of supervision is to make quality social workers. And from the supervisor's perspective, it's to ensure that of course, making sure that they meet the criteria to be a supervisor, make sure that they're competent and the services being provided to the supervisee as they're training them, educating them, acting as that support system for them, and really showing them how to navigate through the world of social work. And if any issues or dilemmas or challenges come up, and creating that safe environment so that the supervisee feels comfortable bringing it to the supervisor. And if the supervisor, of course, identifies anything, making sure that they bring it to the supervisee's attention and discuss that. And overall, just to be a support for them, to give them that guidance, understanding, that insight, so that they can become a qualified social worker as a whole. And on the supervisee's end, making sure that they're doing their part of bringing any challenges, any issues, any dilemmas to the supervisor, addressing it while they're meeting, and making sure that they're putting their best foot forward and doing their due diligence and making sure that they provide quality feedback to the supervisor and on both ends, and making sure that again this is just a healthy overall experience that promotes growth and ultimately just becoming the best social worker possible. And lastly, whether the supervision is happening in an agency, whether it's happening, outside supervision, whether it's happening online, however it's occurring, making sure that all parties are on the same page regarding the agency, the contractual agreements, what happens if something comes up, how everyone's going to address it, how to respond, and everything like that. Dotting the I's, crossing the T's, making sure there's no surprises. We want to avoid everything if possible. And if it does come up, we are addressing it appropriately. So just making sure ultimately that we're proceeding accordingly. Okay, tribe, that's it for today's video. Thank you for tuning in to the best practice standards in social work supervision. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and tell a social worker friend, because we don't want to be licensed by ourselves or even supervised by ourselves or providing supervision by ourselves. I'm gonna put it down in the description below, the link, so that we have access to this and all the other study group information and all that great stuff. And remember, we're going to stay consistent with our studies, go in there, pass our licensure exam so that we can become supervisors one day and provide that quality care to the next generation of social workers. All right, tribe, I'll see you next video.